Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Michael E. Bell, and ASL interpreter Connie. Michael is the retired state folklorist of Rhode Island, and I love that.
Yeah.
He has a Ph.D. in folklore from Indiana University, Bloomington, an M.A. in folklore and mythology from the University of California at Los Angeles, and a B.A. in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Arizona in Tucson. He is the author of Vampires Grasp: The Hidden History of Consumption in New England. Michael's first vampire book, Food for the Dead: On the Trail of New England's Vampires, was a BookSense 76 pick and winner of the Lord Ruthven Assembly Award for the best nonfiction book on vampires. Michael and his wife split their time between Texas and Rhode Island. And I love that because Tom and I split our time between San Antonio and Massachusetts. So I found there are a few others of us that do this.
That's funny.
It
Well,
is,
it's almost 80 degrees today, and tomorrow it's going to go down to freezing. So
Oh no.
welcome to North Texas.
Yeah.
you're there now.
I just got here last week.
Oh
Oh,
wow. Okay.
wow. Just in
So,
time for the weather to get cold down there again.
right. Well,
Oh my goodness. All right, I won't go into the geography anymore. So what are you going to share with us today? I'm so looking forward to it.
well, I've chosen three excerpts to read.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Yeah.
I want to begin with one from Food for the Dead, which was my first book,
Mm,
and then the next two will be from the latest book, Vampire's Grasp.
mm.
Great.
So let me set up the first one, if that's okay.
Of
I
course.
want to I want to read my reconstruction of George Brown's coming to grips with his family's dire situation and how to move forward, knowing that he not only wanted to save his family from consumption in 1892, but he also had to address the real concerns of his neighbors, who were aware that this disease would keep moving through the community unless it was stopped. I pick up the story in Food for the Dead on page 34, at the point where Eddie was George Brown's only son, had returned from Colorado Springs with his wife, knowing that the end was near. Well, as the outcome of Eddie's condition became increasingly evident, George Brown faced a difficult situation. Would he satisfy his neighbors by having the bodies of his wife and two daughters exhumed and examined? We know that he did. Now the question is, why? I arrived at a satisfying answer by assuming one, the people of Exeter, Rhode Island were reasonable and rational human beings, and two, 19th century Americans were no less intelligent than their present day descendants, that is, us. Residents of late 19th century Exeter did not know that consumption was caused by a microscopic organism, had never heard of, much less seen, a germ. Their doctors talked to them about catching it from other people and about family tendencies. Other healers in the region had their own opinions. Some insisted that regular doctors could not cure this disease with their ordinary treatments because its cause was not ordinary. While most people didn't put much stock in the old wives' tales, they were cautious about rejecting outright received traditions. One point everyone seemed to agree on: they had attended too many funerals of family and friends, seen too many die before their time. Consumption was killing more people than any other single sickness. Nobody could do much to stop it. And there were no disinterested bystanders in this community of less than 1,000 people. Those who knew the Brown family were concerned about Eddie's health. When he returned from Colorado Springs, the local newspaper wrote, quote, "If the good wishes and prayers of his many friends could be realized, friend Eddie would speedily be restored to perfect health," end quote. Neighbors were also worried about the wider implications of his illness, that it might become a full-blown epidemic. In helping the Brown family solve its problem, they were protecting their own families. Theirs was a community where consensus took priority over rules and regulations administered by outside officials. The family and neighbors would consult to decide on the course of action, just as Everett Peck had told me during our interview. Some of George Brown's friends dropped by to talk about how they might help Eddie get well and also stop the consumption from continuing on. Perhaps one of Brown's acquaintances told him about a problem he'd had in his own family some years back and how he finally tried an old remedy that saved the life of his family. When he described the procedure, the ritual, Brown found the idea repulsive, didn't think there was anything to it. His hometown newspaper reported that, quote, the husband and father of the deceased ones has from the very first disclaimed any faith at all in the vampire theory, end quote. Even the largely disapproving Providence Journal acknowledged that Brown had, quote, no confidence in the old-time theory, end quote. But Brown agreed to talk it over with Eddie, his son. Reluctantly, they agreed to let their friends undertake the procedure. Brown made it plain that neither he nor Eddie would be present at the cemetery. In March, a young acquaintance of George Brown informed Dr. Harold Metcalf that Eddie was close to death from consumption. He told the doctor that several friends and neighbors were convinced that the bodies of Brown, his wife, and his two daughters must be exhumed and their hearts examined. He said that any heart filled with blood must be destroyed because it was, quote, living on the tissue and blood of Edwin, end quote. Dr. Metcalf dismissed the young man, telling him the belief was absurd. The same emissary returned to tell the doctor that Brown, though not believing in the superstition himself, desired him to come up to satisfy the neighbors and make an autopsy on the bodies. Metcalf attended the so-called autopsies in his official capacity as the medical examiner for the towns of North Kingstown and Exeter in Rhode Island. Although the 19th century witnessed significant advances in the biomedical understanding of tuberculosis, which they called consumption, they were not sufficient to save Eddie Brown and thousands like him. By March of 1892, Eddie was too far gone for any available treatment to work. He was just 24 years old when he died on May 2nd. If we broaden our conception of healing beyond its strict biomedical borders, we might conclude that a family and community were healed, even though the patient died. Folk medicine is successful because it treats the community along with the patient. The patient is not regarded as an autonomous organism requiring a cure. He or she is an integral part of a community, and a death is a loss to the community, a disturbance of the normal rhythm of life. The community enterprise, the community itself, is in danger. The folk practitioner must reunite and heal the broken community. The Providence Journal was not so charitable in its assessment of this community, which they characterized as superstitious, ignorant, uncivilized. These harsh labels seem unjust. It is possible for a reasonable community to accommodate magical acts. I think George Brown realized what role he was being asked to play and why. He knew that no one else could give his son, his family, and his community, himself included, what they required at that moment. Singled out by circumstance to be a folk healer, he reluctantly assented. And there was nothing magical in George Brown's pragmatic decision. So, I'd like to turn to Vampire's Grasp now and read my account of one of the most, I say unusual, other people say bizarre consumption rituals I've encountered. This excerpt is on pages 71 to 74 of St. Clair's grass. The southern portion of the Canadian province of Quebec, known as the Eastern Townships, borders New England and was in 1791, quote, an almost unbroken wilderness. To encourage its settlement, the Crown offered land grants to those willing to undertake the arduous task of turning forests and swamps into farmlands and towns. C.M. Day, in her History of the Eastern Townships, 1869, wrote, quote, a majority of those who came to this section at that time were from the New England states. As a general thing, they were men of large families and limited means, and were no doubt induced to take this step by the feasibility with which land could be acquired. These New England men were mostly of that energetic, self-reliant, and independent temperament that gave assurance of success in any enterprise they might undertake, close quote. The backwoodsman, Jethro Smith, was one of those pioneering adventurers who crossed the border into Canada, settling in the newly formed community of East Danbridge. His plight was recorded nearly 100 years later in a history column of the local newspaper, the Waterloo Advertiser, in 1899. And I'm going to quote the story that appeared in the newspaper. Lot 5 was settled in 1798 by Jethro Smith of Waterbury, Vermont. Smith was known among the early settlers as an experienced hunter and trapper, whose spring guns and steel traps, skillfully set at night, wrought havoc among the bears and wolves, which at that time infested the country. Smith is said to have been a superstitious person who firmly believed in the powers of witchcraft and necromancy, and that the souls of men after death possessed unlimited influence over the living, a sort of strange spiritualism not easily defined. The following story, which I have from our aged friend, E.J. Briggs of this place, may serve to illustrate to a certain extent the blighting influence of witchcraft which swept over the New England states 250 years ago, at which time to have disputed the power of disembodied spirits would have brought ruin to the unbeliever and the unwary, a belief that still existed at the period of which I am writing. 3 of Smith's sons had died lately of consumption. The 4th and last son was stricken with the disease and was living at the point of death. While watching at the bedside of his afflicted son, Smith claimed that he had been accosted by a spirit from the unknown world, who urged him to exhume the remains of his 3rd son, who had lately died, and burn that portion of the body from whence the fell disease originated, by which means the wrath of the devil's dark angel would be appeased and the health of the dying son restored. Smith called on George Briggs, who at that time was living nearby, and entreated him to be present at the burning. Briggs, fully aware that his neighbor was laboring under a terrible hallucination, strove to put him aright, but nothing could be done. That evening, at early twilight, a log heap standing not far from Smith's residence was discovered to be on fire. Briggs hurried away to the place where a harrowing scene presented itself. The afflicted man, bowed down with sorrow and long watching, was walking slowly around the burning heap, calling aloud to the angel of death to make good his promise and restore to health again his dying son. On the following morning, Smith's 4th and last son died, leaving the disappointed and hapless man a physical wreck for life. End of the quoted story. Well, some unusual dramatic elements of the story suggest that it may have undergone some significant changes during nearly a century of telling. 1, drawing a straight line from the witchcraft of the late 17th century to the consumption ritual, thereby fusing these 2 distinct belief systems. 2, Smith learning of the ritual directly from, quote, a spirit of the unknown world, end quote, which seems, when it seems more plausible that he learned of it in New England. 3, the ritual aimed to appease the devil's dark angel, thus releasing Smith's son from consumption's grasp. And fourth and lastly, Smith circumambulating the burning pyre while pleading with the dark angel to make good on his promise. Of course, it is possible that Jethro Smith was having a psychotic episode, laboring under a terrible hallucination, and that therefore the description of his erratic behavior was essentially accurate. Not an implausible scenario given the stress of carving a home out of a wilderness and at the same time coping with dead and dying sons. According to the story, the episode left Smith a physical wreck for life. Well, who was Jethro Smith? Finding the answer promised to be a simple task. Search the records of Waterbury, Vermont for Jethro Smith, then arrange the resulting puzzle pieces to form a picture. But there were no pieces to arrange because there was no Jethro Smith recorded in Waterbury.
Wow.
Widening the search beyond Waterbury created a new question. Which Jethro Smith is the right one?
Oh, no.
Of the 5 candidates, one was born too early. 3 other candidates were not in the right place, Stanbridge East, at the right time, 1798. So I believe our Jethro Smith, as recorded in the 1790 federal census, was living in Washington Plantation, York County, Maine, as the head of a household that included 3 males under the age of 16 years and 2 females. Presumably, he and his wife and 3 sons under the age of 16, and a daughter. Perhaps one son had already died of consumption by 1790, or also likely his 4th son was yet to be born. The evidence unpacked below strengthens the case that this Jethro Smith is the best fit for the exhumation narrative. Jethro Smith was born in 1753 in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Records variously describe his place of birth as Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. However, both Maine and New Hampshire were part of Massachusetts Bay Colony at that time. The recording of Smith's birth does not appear, though, until 22 years after the fact, when he was serving in the Revolutionary War. These records list Smith's hometown as Massabesic, York County, Maine, which was part of the town of Sanford. Smith enlisted on October 6, 1775, probably for an 8-month term, which was the local standard in Sanford at that time. Records show that he deserted and returned to his unit twice. Did Smith, whom desertion records describe as 5 feet 8 inches tall, with dark hair, light-colored eyes, and a scar on ye face, decide to return home to Massabesic? If so, he had lots of company. Desertion was such a problem during the war that George Washington actually expected the Continental Army to dissolve. When the revolution began, American soldiers were enthusiastic about fighting for the causes of independence. But as the war dragged on and the hardships of campaigning mounted, once eager volunteers began to melt away in droves. In fact, prior to the victory at Trenton in late 1776, as many as half of Washington's men had absconded. It's not difficult to imagine Smith weighing his military obligation against the need for caring for his budding family. Well, the end of Jethro Smith's tale, with his last son dying the morning after the ritual, leaving the disappointed and helpless man a physical wreck for life, is indeed the end of his trail. There is no gravestone, obituary, or other record to tell us the fate of Jethro Smith. So I'd like to close my readings with my concluding remarks at the end of my book, Vampire's Grasp. And this is on page 294. Living in a random world of haphazard events is hell on earth. For many New Englanders, routine existence must have seemed like involuntarily participating in a life or death lottery. but one whose mode of selection was beyond comprehension. Consumption ritual participants were culturally at least, Protestant Christians. Grafted on the rootstock of folk traditions, New England's Protestantism encompassed, encompassed a broad range of beliefs and practices. In the introduction to his collection of essays on magical medicine, Wayland D. Hand addressed these apparently unlikely companions, religion and magic. So I'll quote my former professor, Wayland Hand. Christian miracle is often invoked to ensure the success of a ritual that may otherwise, for the most part, be profane in character. These strange juxtapositions are countenanced, apparently, by the need and desperation of the moment. In sickness, more than in any other vicissitude of life, people will throw all caution to the wind, as it were, and resort to trials and actions that they would not even consider under ordinary circumstances. In ultimate ordeals where life hangs in the balance, resort to magic as well as religion is commonplace, if not universal. End quote. Wayland Hand affirmed that while it may be baffling, it is not hard to understand that in times of crisis, these almost antithetical belief systems are shared and invoked as much by the next of kin and by friends as they are by the sick and the dying. Together, at any rate, sacred rite and magical ritual conspire with faith and devotion to the sick to bring about the miracle of healing. I believe that Hand aptly summarized the interplay between folk beliefs and official religious beliefs. Certainly, the resort to so-called supernatural healing, officially sanctioned or not, is a common response to life-threatening predicaments, such as disease. Folklorists have noted that folk beliefs of the kind labeled superstitions are brought into play during circumstances of uncertainty, where people perceive they were at risk yet have limited control of the outcome. But the New England consumption ritual was not incorporated into official religious principles, even when employed by churchmen, and it was. Evidence indicates that the ritual remained wholly secular in its performance. Of course, official cultural systems judge these beliefs and practices as foolish superstitions from a bygone era. But the ritual, but because of its inclusion of corpse mutilation and sometimes cannibalism, was sternly condemned. Ultimately, however, it was implicitly rooted in the prevailing Protestantism of the region, which envisioned an afterlife where a soul grows as the body decays. Death is transfiguring and redemptive. For people suffering in the here and now, knowledge without power amplified their distress. Agency, in this case, a theory of consumption's cure, opened the door to intervention. The consumption ritual empowered a community to literally look death in the face, offering a portal through disease and death, from fear to hope.
Well, that's pretty
That,
powerful, Michael.
Yeah.
that's how I ended Vampire's Grasp.
Yeah.
The whole last chapter is talking about fear and hope and disease and death.
Oh my
Trying to
God.
look back now and, a little bit, try to understand what it might have been like. If nothing is working, it's worth trying something, and maybe you'll
Certainly.
get lucky. At least you're
Mhm.
not just waiting. So I can kind of understand that perspective, even though from your description, the ritual seems kind of bizarre.
Mm.
But there were other
Right.
rituals around too, right? And if you talk about communion, you're talking about the body and the blood of the Christ. And people
Mm.
take that literally if you
Exactly.
have the
Mhm.
transubstantiation. So it's not so far.
Mm,
Right. Exactly. It depends on who's doing and what the context is.
mm,
It's interesting. A friend of mine who did her anthropological fieldwork in Africa said that the people couldn't understand why white outsiders, Europeans would come in and call what their religion primitive and superstitious and ignorant and so on. And they would point to Christian religion and say, look what you're doing. You're cannibals.
Yeah. Wow.
You're eating the body and the blood of this person who died and then came back to life. And why don't you hold your own beliefs to the same standard that you hold ours to?
Right, exactly.
She said that was just a real realization of the double standard that many of us have, that our beliefs are true, everybody else's are wrong if they don't accord with ours.
Yeah.
Well, it's also that sometimes people don't confront the truth or the factualness of the words, right? You can say something and say something, and then all of a sudden, wait a minute. What do those words really mean?
Right.
Really getting into what the language is, as opposed to this is something I've said and absorbed through osmosis, right, from my family and my traditions. But
Well, yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
We're very good at compartmentalizing things in our lives. So we can block off certain areas and not have them examined by other areas. And I think a really good example is the case of Justice Reverend Forward from Belchertown, Massachusetts, who in 1788 wrote a letter to a friend of his where he described, and he was the congregational minister of Belchertown for over 50 years. This is pretty early in his career. But he described how one of his daughters was sick and dying of consumption. And he wondered, in the letter, was it possible for the dead to be preying on the living?
Hmm.
So he went on to describe in this letter, which is it's an amazing document, to describe to his friend how 2 days before he wrote the letter, he had the body of his mother-in-law exhumed and examined after he'd had a consultation with people in the community, just like George Brown family, consulting neighbors to think, what could we do? He said some were against it, some were for it, many opposed it and thought it was awful, but he did it anyway. But he found his mother-in-law was not the right one. So then the next day, he exhumed the body of his married daughter.
Oh boy.
They discovered, well, she might have had fresh liquid blood in her vital organs. So he said, we cut them out and put them in a separate box and buried them a foot above the coffin.
Huh.
Well, here's a congregational minister. He was compartmentalized, really, I think, because his religious belief didn't enter into it, at least according to his long letter, where he went through his thought processes and how he consulted with the community. He never once mentioned, why is God doing this, or is this an affliction from God? It was simply, is it possible for the dead to prey on the living?
Yeah.
You mentioned that this was in New England. Were there, and I actually have often wondered why they called tuberculosis consumption,
Mm-hmm.
where that name came from. But well, actually, in an earlier interview, we talked about how the vampires idea and digging up bodies came from Europe to
Mm-hmm.
the United States. Did it go across our country as well, or was it mostly in New England?
Well, it's mostly in New England or parts of the rest of the Northeast mainly that were settled by people from New England. So I'm writing an article on a case now that I didn't write about in either of these books that comes from southern Ohio around the turn of the 18th century, late 1700s. But of course, the people who settled there were from New England.
Right.
It was called the French Grant in Portsmouth, Ohio, on the intersection of the Scioto River and the Ohio River. And it was called the French Grant because the people from France had been induced to buy shares in this company for land. They were swindled. They got here and they were like, what the heck? And they were mostly from, the suburbs of Paris. and they were not farmers and were not used to a wilderness. This was a wilderness at that time, the
Sure.
Northwest Territory, the Western Reserve. So the New Englanders, they were used to this stuff. So they purchased those lots. And apparently they brought the superstition, if you want to call it that, with them. But it also turns up in Pennsylvania. And again, the family that performed the ritual actually had roots in Rhode Island, not surprisingly.
No.
So you find it like in upstate New York, Pennsylvania, as far west as Chicago and down in Ohio. But mainly those are roots
From New England.
from New England.
I'm
Interesting.
not sure why, but somehow this reminds me of how in English there's like rules for how you put a bunch of adjectives in front of a noun, like a big black rectangular picture frame. And if you said a black rectangular big picture frame, it just sounds weird because you're not saying it right, because you're not following the rules. So we have, internalized rules about all kinds of things, and most of us don't think about it consciously. Of course, linguists do think about this, and they understand the qualities of all the things you say in front of a noun in a phrase like that. And very likely other languages have similar rules, so that native speakers follow the rules, but they don't actually consciously know what they are. And somehow, your description of how folk beliefs worked and people just did them and didn't see them as in conflict, say, with their religion, somehow that, just seems similar to me as to how people work, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, we're a result of not only our DNA but also our experiences,
Oh, yeah.
and we don't always connect the dots that an outsider is going to connect.
No.
Because once you're inside your own bubble, your community or yourself or whatever the context you're in, sometimes that's almost as far as you reach.
Well, just think of all the cures that came forward for COVID that were not.
Exactly. I was going to bring those stuff. In fact, I began Vampire's Grass talking about the COVID-19 uh, epidemic and a lot of the folklore that emerged from that. I mean, folklorists had a field day collecting, folk cures from people. And of course, they're not just face-to-face interaction now in folklore. Basically, it's online, it's social media. And that's now the major platform for the dissemination and transmission of folk beliefs.
Oh, of course.
Kind of the electronic folk community.
Yeah.
We self-select the communities we're in by the social media we engage in.
Yeah.
And if you step back from it and pay attention, there's an awful lot of folklore being transmitted via social media. And some of the conspiracy theories go back to the Middle Ages, but they're still around.
Yeah.
In different clothes. I guess you could say, new wine in old bottles or old wine in new bottles.
Yeah. Interesting. What are you working on now, Michael?
Well, I'm writing this article about the case in Portsmouth. And for the last 2 years, I've been collecting buried alive stories.
Oh, wow.
I know going from one macabre thing to the next, right? But
live stories. I remember hearing a long time ago where dead ringer came from, right? That some people were comatose and they were buried alive, literally. So they kept on putting
right, exactly.
Attached, which was so bizarre to me.
Well, I have a whole chapter entitled "Spread the Fear and Sell the Gear."
Oh, wow.
Oh, do you want to share that with us?
So there's a lot of humor involved in this. Probably it's probably the world's most feared thing to happen to you,
Mm.
you know, to come awake and then you're buried
Yeah.
and there's no way out. It's very fearful.
Yes.
So there's a lot of humor
Mm.
applied to it. And, the people who sold these things, like the bells or they would go around and demonstrate them. They would have themselves buried and
Oh,
then
sheesh.
and demonstrate it. And then people would promulgate false stories in the newspaper about people being buried alive so that they could work up the fear so that they could, create a market
Yeah.
for their products.
Yeah.
But
But
sometimes those are true. I mean, I remember when I was a kid hearing a story about a girl that had gone to her friend's funeral. So she was acting it out with her playmates and they buried her and walked away because that's what she said
oh,
happened. You
yeah, well, there are tragic stories, and it did happen.
yeah,
And
yeah. Or
but
taking the refrigerator door off and the freezer doors.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, because of kids putting themselves inside.
Yeah.
Well, I remember those things happening when I was a kid. In
Yeah.
fact,
We're the
when I
same
was,
generation, so we remember.
yeah, I remember being like, I guess I was 11 years old living in Dallas, Texas.
Mm.
And a friend of mine told me the story about, I guess it happened to somebody he knew or he heard about it, that these people had gone to rob a grave because they knew this woman had been buried with expensive jewelry.
Mm.
So they opened the grave and they start to take the ring off her finger. They can't get it off. So they cut her finger off so they can
Oh.
get the ring. And then she came alive.
Mm. Yeah.
So then they killed her with a shovel and then
Oh
buried her.
gosh.
But then I found doing this research, I found that's an old story that looks like it originated somewhere in Germany,
Mm.
you know, 400 years ago or so.
Yeah, the
And
fairy
it's
tales.
part of folklore. So
Yeah. It's a
the
great
tentative,
story, but how do you verify it?
yeah. Well, the tentative title of this work is Buried Alive in America: Fact, Fiction, and Folklore.
Ooh, yeah.
So,
You wouldn't want to give us a peek in that, would you, before we?
well, there's yeah, people were buried alive for punishment.
Mm. Ooh.
You know that during the Civil War there was an incident in Fort Pillow down the Mississippi River where African American soldiers who were fighting for the Union
Mm.
uh, were not allowed to surrender to
Oh,
the
jeez.
Confederate forces. And so they basically, if they were sick or hurt or wounded, they just buried them alive.
Oof.
And that actually did happen. There were congressional hearings afterwards,
Yeah.
as late as I think 1870, 1871,
Why
which
were
was,
they, why did they do that? What was the logic? I mean, was there logic behind that?
well, no, I mean, it was revenge,
Mm.
hatred.
From
And
the Northerners would do it or the Southerners would do
no,
it?
no, Southerners.
Oh, that would make more
They
sense.
had captured, I'm sorry,
Oh, they're captured by soldiers.
they
Yeah.
had captured these
Uh,
Union soldiers.
mm.
Well, there were two types that they mistreated. One were the African Americans, and the second kind were Southerners who joined the Union cause.
Mm.
So they were equally bad
Uh,
for being traitors to the cause.
so
Yeah, it's
talking
not.
about being buried alive, that is something I think about. It's one of my, I guess, phobias or something. But if you watch, TV or movies, when somebody is buried alive, it's always like 6 inches under the ground, not 6 feet. So
Right.
somehow that irritates me. That's not what would really happen.
You got to dig yourself out. Well, people have dug themselves out. The, I've been collecting the stories mostly
Oh,
from newspaper accounts,
yeah.
and I'm looking at just America because there's already a really interesting book that concentrates on Europe about being buried alive. So I want to give the American story of these.
Equal time, right?
Yeah, equal time for
Yeah,
Americans,
right.
right?
Hey, we may come in later, but
Mm.
we still have it, the folklore.
Is there anything like really different from the American folklore versus the European? Or, what
Not
happens when you're buried alive, or, kinds of stories?
not too much really. I mean, a lot of the same stories
Yeah.
turn up, or at least variants of the same story. Where people will in their will, their last will and testament, will say, please. This is days before cremation became
Mm.
acceptable. Please burn my body, or please remove my head. Do these various things just to make sure that I'm not buried alive.
Huh.
Because some people had this inordinate fear
Yeah.
that that was going to happen to them, in their accounts from the newspapers of people having premonitions of being buried
Yeah.
alive, or dreams. And so that's why they undertake these precautions.
Mm.
It's a fascinating subject.
Well, you can get paralyzed, and people think
Mm.
that you're not really present
Yeah,
anymore, but you are.
yeah,
You just
that's
can't.
a whole, that's a whole chapter too. The catatonic fit, they used to call it, the catatonic fit, where you appear to be dead because you can't move.
Mm.
It's almost like the classic zombie case, where in, the origins of the zombie, where it came from, like in Haiti, someone would be fed some kind of poison so that they would become catatonic, inert. They couldn't move. Their pulse would go down. They would actually be, for all intents and purposes, dead. But they were totally aware in their mind, which must have been frightening when the people that want to control them, who administered this poison, bury them. And so they're aware that they're being buried alive, but there's nothing they can do.
Yeah.
But then the controller lets them know, like, I will dig you up
Mm.
and save your life.
Mm.
I've got the antidote, but you have to promise you will do whatever I say.
Mm.
You will be my slave. I will be your master. And that's where the zombie belief really began, which was in the Caribbean. Of course, now it's you know I think zombies have overtaken vampires as the popular
Yes.
monster.
Yes.
And lately, there's been a lot of scholarly attention to monsters. Several new books have just appeared,
Oh.
and reading these, in fact, there's an article in a recent New Yorker about what's happened to our monsters,
Mm.
because over the last 40 to 50 years, our monsters have become more human. When you go back to Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, or you know, where these monsters, they have feelings. They're just like, they're kind of like us, only they've been misunderstood, or they have a tragic flaw. So the line between humans and monsters in that sense has become blurred. They're just misunderstood. But on the other hand, we're starting to demonize actual humans.
Wow.
So we're turning humans into monsters now,
Yeah.
which some psychologists have been studying that. And that's an interesting phenomenon, like the switching of place
Mm.
with monsters and humans. So there's a new movie on the Frankenstein monster coming out, and where the real monster is Dr. Frankenstein himself.
Yeah.
And his so-called monster is actually more humane than the man, the human. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Earlier, you mentioned there were actual cases of people buried, apparently dead but really alive, that they dug themselves out. Could you say just a
yeah.
little bit more about that?
Mhm. Well, before embalming became the thing. I mean, if you're embalmed, you're not going to be buried alive,
Mm.
basically.
Yeah.
You- and that's one of the same. That's one of the same uh, phenomenon that led to the death of the vampire belief.
Huh.
The people were becoming embalmed. So you're not going to find fresh blood in somebody's heart,
Yeah.
liver, or lungs. You're going to find formaldehyde or some sort of chemical.
Yeah.
And they're not, these creatures aren't going to come out of the grave looking for chemicals they
Yeah.
want to.
No.
So So before embalming became, the socially acceptable way to handle a corpse, and people often were put in the ground very quickly
mm,
because, it's kind of smelly and messy.
no.
And sometimes the graves were pretty shallow.
Okay.
Coffins were not in general use at all times during our
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
Many times people were just shrouded,
Uh-huh.
wrapped in a shroud which was pinned. So it might have been, it was possible for that to actually happen. And of course, there are whole genres of buried alive stories where people uh, come to on the table at the
Yeah.
morgue. It, they're just about to be embalmed, for example, but then they move or make a
Yeah.
noise or groan, and then it's like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh,
Yeah. I've seen that frequently lately on TV and
yeah,
movies. Yeah.
sure.
You're reminding me, a friend of mine was having an operation, and he could hear the doctors and the anesthesiologist and everybody talking, and they thought he was knocked out, but he wasn't, and he was doing all he could to just move his foot so they could
Right.
see that he was still around, because he didn't want them to cut into him
Mm,
while he was still aware.
Mm.
He said
yeah.
what his words were, that particular hospital was known for not storing their drugs properly, so had been
Mm,
expired or not in the
mm,
refrigerator, whatever. But I was like, oh my gosh, you knew that and you went there?
Oh, sheesh.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. I mean, and it becomes a fine threshold too, right? Because the older you get, the more the anesthesia can pull you back
Mm,
so you can't come forward enough anymore. I remember
right.
friends of mine, mom had a broken hip, and they were like, well, if we fix it, we have to put you under to do the operation, but are you going to fully come back? And that's not anything I had ever thought of before she brought this up. And in fact, her mother didn't come fully back.
Mm.
So
Right.
this whole, where is she really? And what happened to the essence of the person?
Yeah, well, anesthesiology I mean, it's not an exact science because we're not all exact replicas.
Yeah,
And every person's going to react differently to the same to, to the same amount of kind of anesthetic
right.
that's administered.
And you
So,
metabolize it differently too, at different,
yeah,
according to your ages, not just the
right.
weight and stuff. Yeah, that's something I had never really thought about.
Well, that's why the medical doctors are recommending, if you're above the age of 80, then maybe you shouldn't be having these routine procedures where they give you anesthesia
Yeah.
to check your colon and whatever, because they have to put you under. And they're going, well, now you're at the age where the risk is becoming greater than the risk of getting, colon cancer or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Since I'm at that age, I'm like, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
I can understand that.
I had one operation. There were like bone spurs on the spine, the neck, and
Mm,
I was apprehensive about that. Fortunately, everything went well. Uh, I don't remember feeling anything, so I don't think I did. So I was, pretty deeply under.
mm,
Uh, but I was a little apprehensive about it beforehand. Fortunately, it went well, which, there's always some
mm.
risk. So uh, I consider myself fortunate in that respect. Yeah.
Well, what's if you've had cataract surgery? That is
Yes.
really strange because you cannot be put under because you have
Yeah.
to keep your eyes open.
Yes.
So that's really kind of a freaky thing to be
I have had.
watching what they're
Yeah.
doing. I've had it on both eyes, and it's
Okay.
like,
I've had it on one side
okay,
uh,
it,
due to probably had an eye injury many years ago.
mm,
In checking up on the eye injury, I have a pretty high discomfort tolerance. So A lot of the stuff they do, it's not exactly pain, but it's really close and it's really
Mhm.
uncomfortable. Yes.
It's more psychological than physical pain to me. It was just,
Yeah.
and of course, anesthetics. In the early days, ether, they are in laughing gas. They would have parties. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've read about the
Yeah, I
parties
remember.
where
Yes.
people would go into a theater and then they would all get blasted on laughing gas.
Yeah.
So they'd be in there, everybody just hilariously, or the ether,
Right.
especially women who had to be near the fainting couch, and they would put ether uh,
Oh,
on their hankies,
yeah.
and then they would and then paint because it seemed so feminine,
Yeah.
in the romantic era that a woman would be down on the
Yes,
Yeah.
needing to be rescued all the time.
Yeah.
That's me,
fainting.
right, right,
Yeah,
Thomas?
Oh no.
and tuberculosis was also in a sense that look, the consumptive look,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
perhaps because there were so many people having consumption and getting that pale wasted look. That
Yeah.
became a kind of stylish look
Yeah.
for people, especially women.
Gosh, what we do to ourselves is crazy.
Yeah,
It's really crazy.
well, we're smart and not smart.
Yeah.
But yes, that's true.
Too smart for our own goods. But
Oh, God.
my parents used to say to my sister and me,
Uh-oh.
Yeah,
"You're too smart for your own good.
Yeah.
Stop
for that one. The other one
it."
was, I wish you a child just like you.
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah, right. Well, I have three of them now, and my wife and I keep reminding them when they complain about
Yeah.
their children.
Uh,
Remember what we said? It's a curse that's passed down in families.
yeah.
Oh, well, Michael, this has been delightful. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
this discussion and for sharing some of your
Sure.
works with us. It's really been great. And thank you all for joining us for this November arts reading and Q&A. We'd also like to tell you that you can get Michael's books from our bookstore. That is bookshop.org/shop/Drake Arts. All of our artists are featured in our bookstore. Yes, all of our artists, all of our authors, and especially this year's. Um, we'd also like to thank our donors for making this program possible. If you'd like to become a donor, please go to drakeetarts.com/donate. We have a donation button there. You can also email us at drakeetarts@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to put you on our mailing list so you can find out about all our Arts Saturdays. This and all of our programs are archived on the Drake It Arts YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@Drake It Arts. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I appreciate it.